Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and welcome to the New Economy Network Australia's what has now become an annual webinar where we get a bit of a budget rundown about the federal budget. And today I'm delighted to introduce you to Matt Grudnoff from the Australia Institute, who is very kindly stepping in for Richard Dennis, who is unwell with pneumonia, and we wish Richard all the very best in recovery. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge country, and it's become a really lovely Zoom tradition. If you'd like to write in the chat whose country you live on, where you are, what the weather's like today. It's a way of having some kind of virtual chat. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present and the remarkable civilizational culture of Indigenous peoples who've cared for country and cared for each other since time immemorial across this continent. I'm lucky enough to live, work and play on the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and want to acknowledge all Indigenous peoples across this continent and around our beautiful planet, and anyone who's on our call today. The work that the New Economy Network Australia, or NENA, gets up to is all about connecting individuals and organisations who can see some of the inherent problems in our industrialised, economic, neoliberal, growth-focused, whatever you want to call it, economic systems. And for the past 5 or 6 years, NENA has been offering a space for people across civil society to learn together, to share together, and to come together to create solutions and projects together. So as of last year, we started inviting the Australia Institute to give us an overview of what went on in the federal budget, given it is the single greatest allocation of taxpayer resources on our continent. It's very important, and also we believe it's important for more of us to be engaged with what's going on in the expenditure of our budgets. I also want to flag with you that NENA is starting to explore the process, or the possible process, of creating a people's budget, perhaps for next year, in time to hand over to governments who may or may not be interested in our perspectives from civil society. So watch this space, we'll keep you up to date. So I think that's all my housekeeping. The process today, Matt is kindly going to talk with us for about 20 or 30 minutes, giving an overview. And I've asked him particularly to focus on, or to tell us where the money is for things like the environment, for social justice, for community well-being, and any of the other issues, the hot issues going on in the budget this year. And then after Matt's finished his overview talk, we'll open up to Q&A. So please do put your questions at any time, write them into the chat, and I'll try to collate them as sensibly as I can, and we'll have a bit of a chat at the end. Okay, enough from me. Matt, thanks so much for joining us, and please do feel free to introduce yourself in whichever way you would like to. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And sorry, I'm not Richard Dennis. Richard's unwell. He's actually he's on the mend, but his voice is still failing. He hoped up until this morning that he'd be able to talk to you, but he thought talking for an hour or so was going to be too much. So I had to step in this morning. I'm Matt Grudnoff. I'm the Senior Economist and Director of the Economics Program at the Australia Institute. And I suppose I just want to take you through some of the highlights of the budget. And I suppose also just to talk to you a bit about what the budget's for. So the first thing to talk about is the budget's obviously all the government's taxing and spending, the federal government's taxing and spending. But people sort of, I mean, that's about $680 billion worth of spending. But in any given budget, they only change a very small amount of that. So we're only talking about 2% of spending is actually new. So that means that 98% of the spending is the same kind of as last time. So we do get very excited about budgets, but it's also important to remember that most of the stuff doesn't change. There's only a small part that changes, and that's the bit that we obviously focus on, and that's the bit the government and the media focus on, but it's only actually a very small part of it. So an important part of the budget is actually finding out what the government thinks is going to happen to the economy over the next few years. In fact, the budget period called the forward estimates is this year and the next 4 years. And the reason the government is or the budget's so interested in the coming years is because the amount of money that the budget collects in tax and the amount that it spends is actually really influenced by how well the economy is doing. So you can't really work out how much, what the position of the budget is going to be unless you know what's going to happen to the economy. So basically, the budget predicts what's going to happen to the economy over the next 4 years. And the predictions that we got in this budget basically show that they expect the economy to decline quite dramatically. So we're expecting that economic growth will more than halve from about 3.5% to 1.5% next year. We're expecting consumer spending in particular to be slashed from about 5.5% to 1.5%. And consumer spending is about 60% of the economy. And the reason it's getting slammed is in particular around housing. So increasing in interest rates and mortgage payments, but also increases in rents. And that's going to impact consumers' ability to spend, which is actually why the RBA is increasing interest rates right now. So the reason they're increasing interest rates is to try and take money out of consumers' spending. They're being very successful at that. And that's definitely going to slow the economy down. They're doing it to try and reduce inflation, but the reality is they're pushing or reducing economic growth quite dramatically. In fact, while the budget papers don't predict an actual recession, so a recession in its technical definition is 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth where the economy goes backwards. If we look at it in per capita terms, the whole of next year is supposed to be what we call a per capita recession. That is, while the economy is supposed to grow by 1.5%, the population is expected to grow by 1.7%. So the population is growing faster than the economy. That means if you work out how much GDP or how much income per person, that's actually expected to go backwards. So we're going to see a real slowdown next year in the economy. We're also expected, obviously, to see an increase in unemployment, as you would expect when the economy slows down. The unemployment rate's about, well, I think the figures came out actually just yesterday, is 3.7%. The budget's predicting that'll go up to 4.25% next year and then 4.5% the year after. Now, if it goes up to 4.5%, that'll be another 140,000 unemployed people. Again, that's actually what the RBA is trying to achieve. The RBA believes that unemployment is too low at the moment, and that's one of the causes of inflation. And so what they're actually doing is increasing interest rates in order to get the unemployment rate back up to what it thinks is the ideal level, which at the moment they believe is about 4.5%. So they'll do that over the next 2 years. So what were the major parts of the budget? Well, the budget basically, some of the biggest parts or the biggest changes were actually around welfare payments. So there was a lot of criticism over many, many years that some of these payments were entirely inadequate, particularly the unemployment payment, job seeker. And in fact, it was well below the poverty line. And the government has made the decision to increase it by $40 a fortnight, which is great, but it doesn't get them anywhere near the poverty line. So in order to put it in context, in order to get an unemployed person above the poverty line, they would have needed to increase unemployment payments by $25 a day. What they've ended up doing is increase it by $20 a week. So they've basically got about 15% of the way to the poverty line, which is still well below the poverty line, but still better than nothing. They also increased, they changed parenting payments so that they don't force single parents onto the much lower job seeker rate until their child turns 14, up from 8. And they've also increased rent assistance by about 15%. So the maximum rate of rent assistance goes up to about $96 a week, or so $94 a week, which in the current climate of having to rent, $94 is not a lot per week in order to find a place to rent. But again, it's still an increase of 15%. The big conversation after the budget was whether or not it was inflationary. As I've said, the RBA is trying to reduce inflation. And so if the government went out and spent a whole heap of money and gave everybody lots of cash, then all that's going to do is add to demand and add to inflation. And the response from the RBA would be simply to increase interest rates again, which is completely counterproductive. So the government basically had to walk this line between trying to improve or provide cost of living relief to people, particularly those at the bottom who were struggling the most, but not provide enough or not to create a lot more inflation that would then provoke the RBA to increase interest rates further. And so that's kind of a difficult line to draw. And what they did was is they provided some of that relief in quite a clever way. So if you just hand out money, as I say, that adds to total demand in the economy, which then can increase prices. But what they did instead is to use an example, their energy price relief, which was basically giving $500 to low-income households to reduce their electricity bills, rather than just giving the low-income householders $500, which they could spend on anything. They've actually directly reduced their electricity bills by $500. Why is that important? Well, when we measure inflation, our main measure of inflation is the consumer price index, the CPI. Well, and it's a basket of goods that the average household spends money on. Well, in that basket is electricity prices. Now, for a big chunk of the Australian population, those electricity prices are going to go down because effectively the government has provided $500 to reduce the price of electricity. So because the prices faced by consumers, or at least some consumers, has gone down, that will actually decrease the CPI. Now, the additional $500 off your electricity bills means those households have $500 to spend on other stuff. So that might have an inflationary impact, but that inflationary impact is being offset by the fact that they've reduced electricity prices. And they did that in a number of areas. So they also did that when they in childcare, which was actually announced in the last budget, but will start on the 1st of July. So childcare prices are in the CPI. The government's increasing the subsidy on childcare, so the prices faced by consumers will go down, which will directly reduce the CPI. They had an increase in bulk billing incentives. So if your doctor bulk bills, your doctor will get more money from the government. Now, if that works, then obviously that reduces the amount of money that consumers have to pay to see the doctor, which directly decreases the CPI. And another one in the environmental area is the government announced that it was going to spend more money on household energy upgrades. So they're basically going to come up with a whole range of stuff to try and reduce people's energy bills by making their houses more efficient, increasing insulation and all sorts of other stuff like that, in order to reduce, including solar panels and other things. But basically, if that reduces a household's energy bill, then again, that will reduce the CPI. There was also in education, 300,000 fee-free TAFE courses, again, reducing prices. And there was stuff around reducing the price of medicines by giving 2 month, allowing people to buy 2 months worth, which at the price of just 1 month, which also decreases the CPI. So all of those things will add demand into the economy a little bit, but all of those things are also being offset by direct reductions in inflation. Now, of course, some of them, like the energy bill reduction, is only a once-off, right? So for 1 quarter, whenever the person gets their bill will be smaller. And of course, in the following quarter, well, the prices will go straight back up again. So it's only a temporary relief. But we think that inflation has actually peaked at the end of last year and it's now coming down. So reducing it for just 1 quarter will help keep, if prices are already falling anyway, will actually be quite useful. Another important area in the budget, or another important area in the economy, probably one of the biggest issues, particularly for most people, is around housing. So right now, not only are interest rates going up, that's affecting mortgage holders, and in particular, younger mortgage holders, people who've got in the market more recently, but also rents are also increasing quite quickly. In fact, they're rising faster than they have for over a decade. As I said, they've increased rent assistance, which will help people on lower incomes be able to rent. And the other big thing in the budget was the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund. That's you might have heard quite a bit about kind of funds recently over the last sort of few years. And well, the cynical part of me says that the reason they set up funds. So, well, I suppose I should first explain what the Housing Australia Future Fund is. Basically, the government's going to put $10 billion into the stock market through the Future Fund, or through other investments, and then the investment returns on that would then fund social and affordable housing. So rather than just fund it directly, they basically set this fund up, and then the returns from that fund will then fund the housing, which seems like a convoluted way of doing it until you realise that the budget has the $10 billion they spend to set up that fund doesn't actually appear in the surplus or deficit of the budget. If the government sells assets or buys assets, that doesn't go to the budget bottom line. So, for example, you might remember years ago, the government sold Telstra off. Well, in the year that they sold part of Telstra off, they got an enormous amount of revenue coming in, and in that year it might have shown a very, very large surplus. But if the surplus was only being caused because they were selling an asset, then we don't really want to include that in the budget bottom line, because it doesn't tell us anything about what's actually happening in the budget. All it tells us is the government sold a big asset. So they basically, years before that, they decided, well, if you sell an asset, we won't include that in the budget bottom line, the revenue from that. But at the same time, they also said, well, if you buy an asset, then we won't include that spending in the budget bottom line. So because the government is buying assets, investments, if you like, either in the stock market or other investments in this $10 billion fund, then that $10 billion fund isn't included in the budget bottom line. Which is why you may have seen a proliferation over the last kind of 10 years of these funds that the governments are setting up. They're really actually just a way of avoiding having to show spending come out of the budget bottom line. So obviously the deficit looks smaller or the surplus looks larger when they do it in this way. I mean, politicians will tell you it's kind of to ensure the funding going forward and that sort of stuff. But I mean, any future government can continue to spend things, and any future government could get rid of funds if they wanted to as well. But to get back to the direct kind of problem of housing, the amount of money they're spending in order to build more social and affordable housing is manifestly too small, obviously, and it's not really even going to touch the side. So while it's good to see the government commit to more spending on housing, they're actually only committing to spend to build an extra 30,000 houses in 2026 over the next 5 years from 2026 onwards. So it's a very small amount of housing compared to what is actually needed, and it's not going to happen for quite a number of years. So I mean, the housing industry probably needs a far larger and more radical shakeup. In particular, sort of two main areas that it probably needs is the government to build a lot more public housing, probably funding the states. I mean, if we go back to the sort of 60s, 70s and 80s, when the government was building lots of public housing, it was basically the federal government funding the state governments to build public housing, rather than setting up sort of funds, rather than trying to induce the private sector to do it. They basically just built it directly. And that was when we saw a lot of public housing come on board. And that's probably what we need to do again if we really want to change things. The other big issue on the demand side is the huge increase in investor demand being driven by the capital gains tax discount in particular and negative gearing. They probably need to restrict negative gearing to new properties and reduce the capital gains tax discount to try and reduce that investor demand, which is basically just pushing up prices. Other areas that the budget had, as I said, in the environmental area, they had funding for energy, household energy upgrades. That was probably the major spending on the environmental side. That was about 1.3 billion over the forward estimate, so over the next 4 years. There wasn't a great deal else in the budget. Obviously, the government has committed to its climate change target, and it got its safeguard mechanism through. And that's going to be presumably the main way it reduces emissions. But there really wasn't a great deal for the environment in this particular budget. There were a few little bits and pieces, but overall, it didn't have a lot. On the tax side, there were a number of tax changes, most of which, or some of, had already been announced. So, for example, the superannuation, they were going to reduce the tax concessions for people's balances over 3 million, who, if you manage to get $3 million into your super account, they won't eliminate, but they'll reduce the size of the tax concession you pay on earnings above 3 million, which was announced earlier. There was a change to the petroleum resource rent tax, and there was an increase in tobacco excise. But on the petroleum resource rent tax, for those that don't know, it's kind of sort of supposed to be a super profits tax on the gas industry, except that it doesn't work like that at all. So right now, we're in one of the biggest gas booms we've ever seen. In fact, last year, the gas industry made $40 billion in windfall profits. So that's just the profits it made because Russia invaded Ukraine and the gas price went up, basically. And so these are enormous profits. And so in this kind of environment, you would expect the PRT would be collecting enormous amounts of revenue. It's not, it's barely increased at all. The government made some changes in the right direction, but they're only going to increase the PRT by a very small amount, about $500 million a year. Just to put into context, remembering we're in the biggest gas price boom we've ever seen, here are some things that collect more money in the revenue than in the budget than the PRT. Tobacco tax excise actually collects about 5 times as much revenue every year than the PRT will, even after these changes. Spirits excise, fringe benefit tax collects more than the PRT. Visa application charges collect more than the PRT, and beer excise collects more than the PRT. So, you know, the PRT is only a very minor revenue source. And this is kind of very disappointing, if you like, at a time when we're seeing such a huge increase in gas prices. Obviously, the Australian people are really missing out when it comes to PRT revenue. That's basically my kind of budget overview, but I'm very happy to take questions if you've got any.
Thank you so much, Matt. Yes, there are some questions, both in the public and private comments. And also I've got a couple that I'd love to kind of come back to some of the points you've made, but thank you so much. And folks, if you have any questions, please don't feel afraid. NENA hosts these events so that ordinary people like me can find out more about the budget. I'm not an expert, you're not an expert, Matt is, but some of us aren't. So please do pop your questions in there. Matt, can we come back to the environment just for one moment? And Ian has asked a question, and I've got a couple too. So Ian Lowe has asked or said, Tanya Plibersek has said that the government will set up a national EPA and resource it to enforce environmental conditions. Was there any provision for improved protection in the budget?
Yeah, so there was a small amount of funding to set that up, but there wasn't, like, in order to finance that expansion, if you like, in the department. But there wasn't anything, there wasn't any major funding for any kind of program. So it's really just a bureaucratic change, if you like. There wasn't additional funding for more environmental protection. There wasn't funding for anything like that. It was just kind of funding the public servants in order to do more in that space, which is a good thing, don't get me wrong, but not a substantial change.
So when you say funding for some public servants to set it up, does that include more positions for people to do enforcement, to do investigations, or? Yeah. Yes,
exactly right. So there'll be more capacity to do that. I don't have the figures on me, but it was basically, if you go into the budget portfolio statements, you can look at by department. So if you look up the environment department, basically there was more spending in that particular area on public servants in order for them to do that.
Well, that's a good start, I hope. So perhaps yes. Ian and myself and others can scurry away and have a look at the detail. And I was just wondering, Matt, if you mentioned that there was a few other bits and pieces in the detail of the budget on the environment. Do you have any info about, some of us are very interested in any of the smaller detail, anything connected to some of the initiatives that the Labor government's trying to put forward, whether it's the nature repair bill or any of these so-called market mechanisms, which are being criticised by many groups, including ourselves. Do you have any of that detail available, or should we check the department?
No, there was very little in the budget on that. Again, it was very minor changes, which either means that what she's proposing is very minor, or it means that they haven't yet kind of set it up and they're not prepared to yet put it in the budget. Excuse me, that's not actually my area, but in going through the budget papers, obviously I had a look for that sort of stuff, and there wasn't very much in it at all, which suggests to me that either it's, as I said, it's quite minor, or they're planning to do it either at the next budget, where there might be more spending. But no, I didn't see anything major at all in that regard.
Thank you. We've had a couple of comments. I'll just group them together. Can you comment on the amount that the federal government is continuing to subsidise fossil fuels? We know that a recent, perhaps last year, a report by the Australia Institute estimated it to be $11 billion a year. Can you talk a bit about what that looks like? Someone's asked, is it really 41.1 billion over the next 4 years? That sounds about right, but what are your numbers, Matt?
Yeah, so that's for both state and federal, that figure. But the largest part of that at the federal level is the diesel fuel rebate, and that increased quite dramatically. So one of the things that increased in the budget, we saw a big increase in those fuel tax credits, that diesel fuel rebate. And so we do that fossil fuel subsidies paper once a year. I think we put it out either it was March or April this year. I would expect that to grow quite considerably, because the diesel fuel rebate is the single biggest line item, and it increased quite dramatically, over $1 billion. And so that will add into those fossil fuel subsidies. So next year's fossil fuel subsidy report will probably be bigger, simply because of the big increase that we saw in the federal budget.
Thanks. I'm actually just looking up. I've got one for 2020 to 2021. Is that the most recent one? No. Is there one?
Yeah, there'll be another one. Probably
Okay.
came out last month.
Excellent. I'll look that up and put the link in for everybody. Matt, don't want to labour the point, but are you able to explain to us really what the broader elements of these subsidies are? Because people often don't understand, is it the government just giving them money? Is it the government letting them have free access to rail or transport or water? What are these subsidies all made up of?
Yes, is the answer to that question. So look, a lot of it, as I said, is basically if you buy your diesel, and if you're, say, a mining company and you have your own road, you're not using public roads, when you pour diesel into your truck, you don't pay tax on that diesel. In the same way that, if you had a car or a truck on a public road, you would pay tax on that. And the reason that this exists is kind of a historical artifact of the fact that way back when the original tax on fuel was designed to fund public roads. That actually stopped in the 1950s. It only lasted a year or so, and then basically now the amount they collect in excise taxes on fuels has nothing to do with how much they spend on roads. But that link was broken, but the link between getting your fuel back, your tax back, if you like, and the link to public roads doesn't seem to have been broken. And why is that important? Well, if you were a mining company, say, and you were looking at trying to, say, electrify your diesel trucks, should you do it? Well, if you're getting your diesel tax-free, it's going to be a lot harder for you to transfer over because the diesel's cheaper. If you are having to pay what everybody else has to pay for their diesel, then it might be economically viable for you to switch over, and therefore you'd use less diesel, less fossil fuels. But because it is tax-free, you'll continue to use that. And so that's why these kind of subsidies are important. And it's not just on mining trucks. Mining is by far the largest user of the fuel credits by industry. The industry often says, well, it's agriculture that's really important. Agriculture is actually one of the minor industries that use it. And there's been kind of suggestions that, they should only apply it to mining, or they should only apply it to companies of a certain size, and that would basically exempt agriculture. So there's ways of doing it to get around those problems. But that's one example. But to get into sort of some of the other examples, particularly at the state level, things like the government will build a road to the middle of nowhere, and that thing in the middle of nowhere is a mine. And when you look, obviously they've built this road for them, and the mine is the only one that's going to use it. And so that's a subsidy. They might give the mine or the fossil fuel project access to free water, so they don't have to pay for water. That would count as a subsidy. So there are lots of different ways that they do it. They're not often straightforward where the government's just giving money to the mining project. Another common way they do it is the resources of Australia, all the resources, all the iron ore, the coal, the gas, all of those kind of things, the gold, whatever it happens to be, are owned by all of the people of Australia. And the way we do that is the mining company doesn't actually own the coal that they dig up, for example. They have to buy it off the Australian government. And they're called royalties, basically. So, and often what governments can do is basically reduce or make whatever the mineral is that they're digging up royalty free, at least for a period. So they'll give them a holiday on their royalties, which is another subsidy where they don't basically have to pay for the good that they're digging up. So those subsidies, they come in lots of different forms, but they're kind of some of the major ones.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Belinda has just done a follow-up question, which she says, is it clear in this budget how much is going to these sorts of subsidies? The short answer, Belinda, is no, it's not clear. It's very hidden. And that's why the Australia Institute does this annual report now on the total amount of these fossil fuel and other subsidies. And I will find the link in a moment. I thought it was last year, but Matt said a report has come out. The time is moving strangely for me this year. A report came out last month, so I'll find that link and send it to you. And Belinda and others, if you're interested in this, definitely keep an eye on the Australia Institute's analysis each year and hold it with you. And that's the best information you're going to get in terms of arguing how we can change our economy. A new economy that focuses on people and planet wouldn't be putting $11 billion a year or thereabouts into these kinds of industries in any way at all. So, Eva, you've been very patient. You've put your hand up, but did you want to ask the question yourself, or would you like me to read it?
I wanted to. I'm sorry I was a bit late, but I don't think I managed to miss it because I think the entire system missed it. But was there any sort of signs of them doing anything about the privatisation that's undermining childcare, aged care, and all of those things there? I mean, they also made it fairly clear that they couldn't even ensure that the additional money that would go to the wages in aged care was going to go to them, because they had they said, oh, somebody was standing there saying, oh, it's all right, they can have a look at the 6 monthly review and see whether it has been spent by the owners. I mean, I'm very concerned about the fact that we have actually really little that looks at that whole privatisation area, which is undermining a very large amount of community services and so on. And there's no, apart from additional bits of money for the aged, there's no signs of what they're going to do.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the answer is no. This government seems to be embracing kind of these private providing of these kind of care things, like you said, in childcare, in healthcare, in aged care, and also in disability care, the NDIS. And that's a big issue, because when the government is the sole payer, if you like, of these services, or a large part of it, like in childcare, because they give a large subsidy, it basically allows the private providers to game the system. And private provision of it becomes far more expensive than if the government just did it itself. Part of the reason why the NDIS, for example, the costs are escalating so dramatically is that you have a situation where the disabled person gets a fund of money from the government in order to pay for this stuff, but they're not quite sure what those things are worth. The private provider is able to sort of game the system and increase the price. But if you think about what the alternative might be if the government provided that service, well, then the government would have an incentive to not game the system and not make it cost too much, because they're ultimately the ones paying. And so we've got this weird area, particularly in the care economy, and particularly where the government's the main provider of funding, where we have this situation where it can become really, really expensive very, very quickly. And all of that's really just flowing into profit for private providers. And I think that's something that the government really has to grapple with, because, I mean, if you want to know where these problems are, you just have to follow the Royal Commissions, right? We had a Royal Commission in aged care. We had a Royal Commission into disability care. And you can follow those and you can see, well, what do they all have in common? Well, the problems stem from the fact that we have all these private providers who are in there for a profit, who are thinking, well, what I need to do is I need to maximize my profit. So how can I maximize the amount of revenue I get and minimize the cost? So they're doing the very bare minimum and charging as much as they possibly can for it. And in these kind of situations, I just don't think that works. It's not the best outcome for the government, budgetary, but it's also not the best outcome for the people they're providing care for, because these people are providing the bare minimum. And we did research in 2022 on childcare, where we compared for-profit providers and not-for-profit and state providers. And we found that because of this profit motive, and because basically for-profit providers were taking money out of the system in the form of profit, they either charged higher prices or they provided less quality care. And that's what you see also in aged care, and you also see that in disability care. And unfortunately,
can I just add a couple of points? I mean, part of the problem also is that by doing that, they're actually removing one of the things that the voters want, which is a sense that they have some sense of ownership and commitment in the childcare, aged care, other areas, instead of having some strangers living it in their thing. So it's part of creating a sense of social cohesion, yes, and absolutely, a sense of goodwill and local community things, because people would feel they own the local childcare or aged care thing. But if it's run by some mob that's sort of actually in the USA, where the money goes to the shareholders, yep, you end up distrusting government.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yep. So yeah, these kind of private providers do nothing for social cohesion, which is something that we need more and more, particularly when you look, for example, in the US. You just have to look over there and see what happens when social cohesion begins to break down.
Thanks, Eva. For those who don't know, Eva Cox is a rather renowned researcher in Australia, so do look up her work as well. Thank you for your questions, Eva. There's actually a really great question which I was going to ask. Michelle Smith has asked. Sorry, I can't find the comment, but it was last year there was a bit of a big deal about Jim Chalmers framing the budget as a well-being budget, which got many of us, thinking, oh, maybe Australia's finally going to catch up to other things that are going on. Can you comment, Matt, on To what extent was that part of the discourse around this year's webinar, this year's budget? And has well-being appeared in any of the materials or promo that the government's been talking about for the budget?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So, as a bit of a background, a number of countries have moved towards a well-being budget. The idea behind that is rather than just measuring what the budget bottom line is, whether it's a surplus, whether it's a deficit, how big it is, we look at kind of policies the government are putting forward or things the government are doing, and we frame it in a broader context rather than just the dollar cost. So what is it doing for inequality? What is it doing for people's well-being? All sorts of other possible sort of metrics to look at this rather than just the dollar value of it. And New Zealand recently has gone this way and quite successfully. And while the coalition government kind of mocked the Labor government when they suggested they should do that when Labor was last in opposition, the Labor government has, in the last budget, which was actually only in October, that was kind of, they had a mini budget after the election. And Jim Chalmers had an entire piece in the budget papers kind of discussing about how we might do this. And it was effectively a discussion paper to kind of raise ideas and have people think and talk to the government about how this might happen. And there was kind of quite a flurry towards the end of last year of the government consulting with various groups on this. And this year there's been absolute silence. So when the budget came out, I did a control F, a search through all of the budget papers to find well-being budget, and it wasn't there. It's not mentioned at all. Since the budget's come out, I've kind of listened to a lot of the commentary, and I haven't heard anybody in the Labor Party, Jim Chalmers or anybody else, talking about the well-being budget. Now, hopefully that's because they're busily squirreling away somewhere doing it. That's the optimist in me might say that. The pessimist in me thinks, well, I hope it just hasn't slipped off the table. Because it is really surprising. Even if they were kind of doing it in the background, you would expect Jim Chalmers to say something about it, even if it's just to say, we haven't forgotten about it, we're doing something. But it has been complete radio silence on this, which is really concerning and really disappointing.
That's what we observed too, but we always just assume we're not focused on this enough. We didn't catch it.
I went looking for it.
Yeah, and can I ask, Matt, in your opinion, do you think that this is a deliberate thing? Have they received a lot of pushback? My perception was that they didn't actually get a lot of pushback from industry or others, because in a lot of ways the Australian attempt at looking at well-being was pretty diluted. It wasn't particularly radical. There hasn't been a lot of pushback.
No, I didn't see almost any pushback at all on it. I mean, it was basically just a way of looking at government programs from more dimensions. And so, yeah, as you said, there wasn't really any industry pushback at all. It may be that they thought it was too hard. Certainly, it depends on, like, wellbeing budgets can be done in lots of different ways. And one of the traps is to basically come up with wellbeing units and try and measure everything. But the problem with that is take something like the voice referendum, right? So there was funding for the budget for the voice referendum. How many wellbeing units is the voice, if it succeeds and gets up and is working, how many wellbeing units is that going to improve Australia by? If you compare that to, more funding for women fleeing domestic violence, can you measure those two things in units and compare them? Well, obviously you can't, and it's crazy to try and do that. That doesn't mean that there aren't things we can do around a wellbeing budget to kind of expand why these things are good beyond just their dollar value. But if they just wanted to kind of turn it into a kind of treasury kind of dollar or unit idea, then they're probably going to run into a lot of problems. And Treasury came and we talked with Treasury about this, and that's basically what we told them is what you probably need is a broader list of things that you want to tick off when you're looking at a new proposal. So how many ticks or how many crosses does this particular proposal have? So there are definitely ways you can do it, but there are also terrible ways you can try and go down a rabbit hole and never succeed at anything. So I'm not sure why they haven't. We're going to try and talk with Labor and raise that with them, but we haven't got any answers yet.
Thank you, Matt. And for those who are interested, NENA is one of the sort of co-founding groups supporting the exploration of building a We All Australia, a wellbeing economy Australia, which would be a hub connected to We All, the Wellbeing Economy International Network, which NENA was born a year or two before it emerged. And we're watching the wellbeing framing as something that can be quite useful and powerful. Here in Australia, we've got something that's been on the bubble for a while, the Australian National Development Index. And one of our frequent speakers in webinars, Mike Salvaris, is connected to that. And I also just want to mention, we've had a really excellent webinar a couple of weeks back with Sophie Howe, the outgoing Commissioner for Future Generations in Wales. And they went further than just a wellbeing budget, and we're actually looking at, the Act was all about, is all about future generation, the wellbeing of future generations. So if anyone's interested in exploring what this wellbeing stuff might look like, or maybe it's something you want to link to with your work, have a look at that webinar with Sophie Howe, talks by Catherine Trebek, who was one of the co-founders, now based in Australia. And there's a lot of other material on the NENA website. So yeah, keep in touch with all of that. I've got two more questions for you, and then we'll see how we're going for time. And I'm keeping an eye on comments and questions from everyone. You mentioned the voice, Matt. I was wondering if you could speak to any other commitments in the budget connected to Indigenous programs or support or initiatives.
Yeah, the main one was the voice funding. And there were some funding, I think probably that came out of the criticism, particularly in Alice Springs. So there was some more funding around those kind of programs. But again, not a dramatic increase at all. But yes, so most of the funding was the voice. One of those, so budgets can be, the budget papers are vast. They have a lot of things in them. And sometimes you kind of find that surprising and kind of sad moments in them. And one of them was around the voice. Included in the voice funding, there were lots of different parts for the voice funding, was an additional $10 million during the voice campaign for First Nations mental health, which is obviously there because this is going to be a particularly difficult time. You know, and look, obviously that is a great thing that the government does, but it's a kind of a reminder too, sometimes that you know, the debate that we're about to have is going to be very difficult, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
That is a terrible, I mean, it's a very jarring statistic. And I know from personal experience that during the referendum around equal rights to marriage, the impacts on many of our colleagues and friends were absolutely devastating. To be singled out, to be objectified, to be talked about in public places by others. It's a very grueling way of talking about our fellow Aussies. So yeah.
And I think the government, they took that debate and thought about what impact it might be having on First Nations, and that's why it's allocated the funds. But again, it's a reminder of you know, these kind of changes can be quite painful. Yeah,
thanks, Matt. There's a couple of questions about housing, and what I wanted to do was come back to this $10 billion housing future fund, Matt. I'm no mathematician, but even mathematically speaking, if they invest $10 billion and only get a few percentage points returns, I mean, what are we looking at? I mean, is this a complete removal of the federal government's commitment to investing in public housing if it only makes a couple of $1 million a year? And then what happens to it? Will it be just filtered down into the Department of Housing to spend, or is it going to be going out to the marketplace yet again?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the housing policy in Australia is hugely complex, and the cynical part of me says it's complex to hide the kind of what the government is doing. So it wasn't just the $10 billion fund. There were also these complicated changes to depreciation rates and tax withholding rates. And if you feel yourself eyes glazing over and going to sleep just hearing those words, you are not alone, right? What basically the government does is it doesn't build public housing like they used to build. What it does is it tries to encourage private providers to build housing that they then rent out at hugely subsidised rates. Now, in order for the government to do that, they've got to make it worth the private provider to do that, right? So if the private provider is targeting, I don't know, 8 or 10% return, and renting it out to somebody on a low income is only going to give them a 1 or 2% return, then effectively the government has to pay them, 6, 7, 8% in order to induce them to go out and build this house. The problem with that is the government could borrow at 4%, right? And just build the housing directly. Now that's less than what they have to induce the private provider to do it. And what's more is if the private provider does it and the government's inducing it, the private provider owns the asset at the end. Whereas if the government builds the public housing, the government not only pays less for it, but they own the asset at the end, right? And now, when you explain it like that, that sounds stupid. So why would the government, why does the government do it? Well, the first reason is because it doesn't want to own the asset. It doesn't want to directly fund public housing, because then people would see what they were doing. And for some reason, that's not what they want to do. And so we get this really weird kind of convoluted thing to kind of hide the fact that they're having to induce the private sector and the not-for-profit sector to do this. And so that's why we have changes to depreciation rates. That's why we have changes to withholding tax. These are basically tax concessions, if you like, that the private providers can access that improve their rate of return, if you will. And so honestly, what should the government do? Well, the government should either do what they did in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and just fund the states to build public housing, or do it directly themselves, or the government could just build it directly like they do now. So there's the Defence Force housing, right? Yeah. The government owns a huge amount of housing and has built that housing for the Defence Force as part of their kind of salary package, if you like. They get discounted housing. So the government already does this, that they've already got that in place. You could just expand that. And it would be a lot simpler, it would be a lot cheaper, and they would be able to build more housing and also be held responsible for how much housing actually comes onto the market. Because we would know directly, well, how many houses have you built? Well, this many. Right now it's, well, we're helping fund, the private sector do kind of all of this housing, and maybe we're involved in that particular house, or maybe not, but you can't really see it clearly. There's no transparency in the way they're doing it.
Matt, would it be fair to say that approach, that convoluted way of working, but primarily to justify to big businesses and corporate interests that they're letting the market do the work, this is absolutely neoliberal framing. And as you say, the government was happy to invest in these kinds of social services up until the 80s, when we were hit with this tsunami of framing everything as the market will fix it, the market knows best, the Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher neoliberal thing. So it seems to me that not just the housing fund, but all of these other funds is really the government justifying to big business rather than the people, that they're letting the market be involved in these kinds of initiatives that the government should just be sorting out. And we had a big webinar yesterday on carbon offsets and nature offsets and the nature repair bill. And a number of people said direct intervention to respond to climate change is the only thing that's going to work, using these market-based mechanisms to pretend that we can offset one unique ecosystem with another, or appeal to the market to do eco-restoration. All of these things are what some would call weasel words. Others might call just veering towards evil, just a way of keeping in cahoots with big business, large corporate interests, while not getting the job done of looking after our society and planet. So that
it's this belief that in all things, markets can do a better job. Now, I'm an economist, right? I actually quite like markets. There are times when markets are really great things, and that we totally should use it. Do I think the government should take over all the cafes and decide, what flavored muffins we have available, and what kind of coffee and milk and whatever else? No, the market probably does a really good job. Why? Because there's heaps of competition. If one cafe is doing a really crap job, you can walk, a few meters down the road and try another one. So you've got an actual situation where all of the incentives are right to make sure that the market is providing you with the lowest cost and the highest quality, and you have lots of options. But in some areas, in a lot of areas, the markets aren't the best way of doing things, and in particular public housing, but there's a whole other host of other areas, particularly as you said, in the environmental area, or even in healthcare. I mean, you just need to look at the US. The US pays almost twice as much for healthcare. That's all the private and public funding of healthcare, and gets than Australia, and gets a worse outcome, because the private sector charges a whole lot more, and they have very little public funding. And that's the case across the world. You look at the countries that have a socialised healthcare, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the UK, a lot of the European countries, they all have better outcomes, and they all spend less than developed countries that have a privatised system. There are sometimes we just have to accept when markets are not the best deal, and that the government can do a better job.
Yeah, and I think this comes down to valuing our society first and thinking about the economy as serving our people and our society, for sure. Got quite a lot of questions rolling in now, so thanks for your patience, everyone. I will try to get through all of them. And Matt, I hope you're still okay for another 20 minutes or so. That would be great.
No worries.
Excellent. Brandon has asked a question about modern monetary theory, which I feel like I should put to you, and I hope that you can elucidate. One of the aims of modern monetary theory, or MMT, is to achieve full employment by printing money. However, one of the handrails of MMT is the potential for high inflation. Given the current situation of high inflation and low unemployment, is it worth considering the potential effectiveness of MMT and the possibility of a paradigm shift away from neoclassical economics? It's a long question, but a lot of folks in our networks are interested in this MMT. Can you explain a little about this question and answer?
So what MMT does really, really well is that it removes everybody's focus from the money, which doesn't matter, to the real economy and what it could create, which does matter, right? So money is just exists in order so that me as an economist doesn't have to find somebody, when I want to go and buy some food, I don't have to find somebody who wants to be tutored in economics who also grows bananas or apples, or, basically it stops barter, right? That's why money exists. And money is also just something the government creates. Now, it can't create an unlimited amount of money, obviously, but the dollars that you have in your wallet, the government could create more or less of them very, very easily. But that doesn't mean that there's no constraint. If we just printed forever, right, that's not going to get us more stuff. There's actually a limit on how much the economy can create, if you like. So if we had everybody working and we had all of the capital equipment, the factories and all of the machinery that we need to create stuff, there's an absolute limit on how much we can create. And what MMT says is, don't worry about the money, right? What you need to focus on is, what can the economy create? And that's why we talk about full employment. Full employment is basically when the economy is creating as much as it can, because everybody's employed. So unemployed people reduces how much an economy can create, because instead of working, they're not working. So they're not making as much stuff. So the economy is making less stuff, right? Does that make sense? So, so that's the good thing about MMT. Now, how do we know when we've printed too much money and the economy can no longer expand because it's kind of reached that limit? Well, that's when we begin to see inflation. And as you say, unemployment's quite low. If you were to print a whole heap of money right now and shove it into the economy, the economy doesn't have the ability to make more stuff. So therefore, what it'll do is it'll put up the prices. So imagine you're a business person, okay, and suddenly a lot more consumers come banging on your door and want your product. If the economy, if we were in kind of a downturn, there were lots of unemployed people, your factory was only working at half capacity, and lots of new people showed up and demanded your goods, what would you do? Well, you'd probably hire more people, make more goods, and make a big profit by selling more stuff, right? If, on the other hand, we're at a different point in the economy is booming, you can't find anybody, extra people to hire, you're currently running a day and a night shift in your factory, so you've got no more capacity to expand, and suddenly more people started banging on your door wanting your product, what would you do? Well, you can't produce more, so you're going to put your price up in order to make a bigger profit. And that's effectively what we're doing, but at an aggregate scale, right? So if the economy is in a downturn and well below full employment, additional money creates additional demand, will just mean that we will expand the economy, right? We won't see prices rise. Firms will just produce more, okay? But if we're at that capacity and there's more demand and you print money, then all they'll do is put up their prices. And when they all do that, that's what inflation is. So right now, printing more money right now is not going to produce much more except for more inflation. The other problem we have, which is not related to MMT, is the RBA is actually targeting a 4.5% unemployment rate. So, you know, if suddenly demand were to increase and more people were to get jobs, the RBA would freak out, put interest rates up and create more unemployment, because what they really want to do is concentrate on that inflation. Now, I don't agree with the RBA and their kind of natural rate of unemployment, but that's basically what would happen right now in a kind of mechanistic way. The RBA governor would increase interest rates. So yeah, printing more money right now is probably not a good move. But, you know, that said, during the COVID recession, it was absolutely the right thing to do because there was plenty of excess capacity within the economy.
Thanks, Matt. There are a number of people I was just reading who were asking, interested in your response to this MMT. And also just coming back to unemployment, someone's asked, or someone said, you mentioned this RBA wanted to see unemployment at a certain level or increase. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you might hear the natural rate of unemployment, or the NAIRU, which stands for the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is a mouthful. But basically, the RBA is obsessed with inflation, right? For reasons that sometimes elude me, they're absolutely obsessed, so much so that they've redefined. So the RBA has basically two main goals: stability of the currency, which includes inflation, and maintaining full employment, right? Now, the RBA has taken the term of full employment and redefined it to mean inflation, so that then they can just target inflation. So what the RBA believes, and this is what the RBA, it's not what I believe, but this is what the RBA believes. The RBA believes that if the unemployment rate goes below the natural rate, right? So they think that the natural rate's 4.5% and we're at about 3.7, so we're below. What's going to happen is there's going to be huge shortages of labour. Firms are not going to be able to hire people. Workers will have lots and lots of bargaining power so that they'll be able to increase their wages quite rapidly. And businesses will put up their prices, and that will cause inflation. And inflation for the RBA is the worst thing in the world, okay? So what the RBA has to do is they have to get the unemployment rate back up to the natural rate in order to stop inflation from increasing, okay? So built into the RBA's understanding and thinking, and when they're sort of looking at how they're going to set their interest rates, is this idea that the unemployment rate can't go below the natural rate. It is at the moment. So what they're doing is they're increasing their interest rates in order to slow the economy down, reduce inflation, and get that unemployment rate back up to 4.5%, which is where they think the natural rate is, in order to stop inflation from occurring.
This sounds like a lot of confusing little games and card shuffling to me, but someone's just asked, who defines what the natural rate is?
Another great question. The natural rate is unobservable, right? You can kind of try and work it out by looking at its effect on other things. But the biggest problem conceptually with the natural rate is that you can't measure it and it tends to move around, which means that is it really there? Or, like, so if suddenly the unemployment rate changes and we don't see the reaction that you would expect, then the RBA just says, oh, well, the natural rate moved. And there's no real rhyme or reason to how it's moving. The natural rate idea was really big in particularly the 80s and 90s. Most of economics has moved on, and you might have remembered that the RBA had a review recently, and one of the findings was that the RBA's thinking was very insular and they weren't open to new ideas. And I think they're still stuck in the 90s, the 80s and 90s, when it comes to this concept. And they haven't kind of let the rest of sort of economic theory catch up with them. And so who decides where the natural rate is? Well, the RBA effectively does research. They have a team in there that tries to work out where the natural rate is. And just, I think it was last week, they released their latest finding on where it was, and they had it at 4.5%, which I think was roughly where it was before too. But if you listen really closely to Philip Lowe, you can actually hear him talk in his kind of coded language about targeting the natural rate and basically targeting the unemployment rate. He doesn't say it openly, obviously, because most people don't know this, and they'd probably be very upset if they thought, particularly when you think about what do politicians say, they're always saying, well, my main focus is creating more jobs. I need to create more jobs. Well, right now, if politicians were, effective at creating jobs, then all the RBA would do is increase interest rates more until those jobs disappear.
Been a few comments about smoke and mirrors. May I just offer a small antidote to the complexity of our federal budget or so-called economic system? Later in June, Localisation Week, we'll be talking with people from around the world and across Australia about what a localised economy looks like, the real economy, some people like to call it. I know it doesn't mean we can avoid some of these other issues, but it is a relief when we can discover so much of what we do. If we shorten those supply chains, buy things locally, step away from some of this stuff, it just makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? Anyway, that's a small aside. Matt, you're doing so well. It's all these questions being fired at you. We'll take a bit of a change of direction now. Judy has asked, are there any examples where governments directly provide childcare or aged care now? Are these only provided by the state governments rather than the federal government?
That's a great question. For childcare, I don't believe the federal government provides any. State governments definitely do, but I don't believe the federal government does. And I think it's the same for aged care. So it is government provided effectively. And to be clear, the federal government raises all the revenue. So they're the ones with all the money. The state governments do have taxes, but they're far smaller. And one of the biggest expense in the budget is actually giving the money to the states. So all of the GST revenue goes to the states, but beyond that, the federal government gives a lot of money to the states. Why? Because the states have responsibility for, healthcare and education, all these very expensive service providers, including things like childcare and aged care. And so it's usually the state government that runs the facility where there's a government facility, but they're basically funded by the federal government. So yeah, no, to my knowledge, there are no federal government childcare or aged care facilities, but there are definitely state government ones.
Thanks, Matt.
Eva might know better than me. I'm just looking up there. She's all across this stuff.
The federal government directly funds a lot of centres, particularly the private centres get funded directly by the federal government, and other funds go to the state government and also to a whole lot of other places. So the federal government actually sets up the process, but then doesn't necessarily have control over it, and that's the point. There are a set of rules and things that they're supposed to stick to, but it's a very messy thing. The trouble is there's something like 80%, I think the estimate is, of private sector places, and they're put in place. The other problem is that there's no control now. There used to be control over where they were, so, whether the funding went to areas that had needs. And now, because they're dependent on a service being set up there, and they don't provide the things for the public sector anymore, the funds, the capital funds, you get whole areas. I think somebody did a big report on it, where they talked about childcare deserts, because they weren't attractive to the private sector, because people were fairly poor and they didn't have enough money to give them a big profit margin. A lot of those places have got no childcare, so it's a really messy collection of ways and means, of some private, some public, some, you know, sort of locally owned. Local government used to run a lot of them, but then they offloaded them into the private sector in many cases. So it's, you know, it's a mess, and it really needs to be fixed up, because the problem is that it's got very low levels of employment, because people don't want to work in it because it's hard work
and poor pay.
Aged
Poor
care.
pay.
Yeah, and so
Okay,
I mean,
thanks, Eva. I'm just aware of time. We
Yeah.
might stay focused on chatting with Matt about the budget, but thank you very much for your input. Can I just ask Matt, there's been a very simple, nice, straightforward question. Someone, I think it was Graham, has asked, how can I access the budgets? Is there one simple document that I can search, or is it a collection of papers?
Oh, great question. Right. I get very excited by the budget, so we call it Economist Christmas here. Yes, so if you go to budget.gov.au, you have the budget papers. Just a quick rundown. The most interesting ones are budget paper number 1 and 2. In particular, number 2 is basically all the new measures. So budget 2 is basically just a big list of all of the changes the government is making in this budget. And it tells you what the impact will be over the next 4 years, in, you know, whether it'll cost more money, or it'll save more money, or it'll cost more revenue, it'll get more revenue, or it'll reduce revenue, whatever that happens to be. And then it has a description of what the change is. So that's budget paper number 2. Budget paper number 1 basically gives you the big overview. So it's broken into different chapters. It basically starts with an overview, and then it talks about what's happening to the economy, the Australian economy and the world economy. As I said earlier, that's important because it has implications for how much the government's going to raise and spend. And then it goes through all of the all of the taxing parts. So it looks at how much all the taxes are, and then it looks at where all the spending is, not the new spending, but all of the spending. And it breaks it down by, you know, defence and social security and health and education. And it basically looks at what's being spent in each of those areas. So they're probably the 2 kind of budget papers that are most interesting.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm trying to get to some questions in amongst a lot of opinions, which are lovely, but I can't read them all out because we won't have enough time. Claire B has commented that there was an increase in funding for Indigenous land and sea ranges. So that's an excellent thing to see in the Indigenous funding. And Claire has also said, or it's a question, I think, did the COVID handouts of billions of dollars get us into the inflationary mess we're in now?
Yeah, good question. I don't think so. So if we look at, if you have a look at the consumer price index, which is our main measure of inflation, but not the only measure, but the main measure, the inflation didn't correspond to when the government was spending lots of money. In fact, the government's spending was rapidly decreasing when the inflation took off. It corresponded to 2 main things. The first is when Russia invaded Ukraine. Why was that important? Because Russia was a big supplier of gas and oil. And when the sanctions, the rest of the world slapped the sanctions on, obviously the amount of gas and oil flowing into the economy decreased, all right, and the prices went up. So that's why our energy costs go up. But it also increased things like fertilizer prices, because fertilizer prices are linked to the gas price. And it also increased, so Ukraine was a huge producer of grain, okay, and obviously they're not producing nearly as much now because they're being invaded, and so there was a kind of dry up in that. So there were a lot of different aspects of why the invasion of Ukraine basically caused, you know, prices in a number of areas to rise. The next major thing was, as we opened up from COVID, there was a huge demand for goods rather than services. So most of the stuff you buy is actually services. People spend more money on services rather than actual physical goods. But because we're in lockdown, and because even as we emerged from lockdown, people were still reluctant to go out, we saw a lot more demand for goods. Now, services can be shipped around and transported fairly easily, but goods, you've physically got to transport them around. And basically, particularly in shipping, that got all gummed up as economies emerged. And so people couldn't transport stuff. And firstly, it was costing a lot more, but they physically couldn't get stuff quickly from one place to the other. And that also raised prices. On top of that, we've got like the climate emergency, and there was a whole lot of flooding in various parts of Australia. So lettuce prices were suddenly huge and potato prices were in short supply. They were also adding to inflation. But none of that has anything to do with demand in Australia. So it wasn't a demand induced inflation. So if the government was printing lots of money and it shouldn't have been, then we would have expected to see the kind of inflation to be demand side inflation. But what we actually saw was supply side or cost side inflation, which is not because of excess demand, but is rather because of some kind of supply shock, which is what we saw. So no, I don't think that the COVID measures had much to do with the current inflation.
I just said thank you, and there are so many questions connected to the COVID days, but we don't have time for them. So many interesting things, so many opportunities that perhaps weren't taken after what we saw with localizing our economies after COVID. There's another question here, which I keep losing. Hanging in there. There we go. Peter has said, perhaps this is a good one. We might end up on this one today. Not a good one, probably a depressing one. Considering the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, in your opinion, Matt, does the budget do anything significant for the environment, the biodiversity crisis, or global warming?
No, not in this budget, certainly. Yeah, I mean, the government has promised quite a bit. A lot of what they promised doesn't look like, I don't think will work particularly effectively, particularly in biodiversity with their kind of biodiversity markets. It's a classic case of using a market when it probably isn't appropriate at all. But there wasn't a great deal. There was some spending. I mean, there's always some spending in this area, but it didn't feel like it was a major area of concern. I think the government's main focus was on cost of living, in particular for people who are poorer people. I don't think it was particularly focused on climate change or biodiversity or the environment, and there wasn't really that much in the budget. And where there was some, I mean, the biggest single environmental measure was actually a cost of living measure. That is the what was it called? The household energy upgrades. And, you know, I mean, that was actually sold as a cost of living measure. That will help the environment by reducing people's reliance on fossil fuel and reducing their energy costs. But in reducing their energy costs, that was kind of the main purpose of that particular thing. So no, I don't think there was very much at all in the budget on the environment.
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, I think even I was shocked to see they were going to spend 1.3 billion on household energy upgrades. I'm the first one to cry out for energy efficiency and demand management, but if you can spend 1.3 billion on that, then surely some of the measures we need to support the foundations of life, biodiversity, land care, etc., are also more important or equally important. And Claire B has asked a question, I think, that's on the minds of many of us. She has said, I'm so worried about the green Wall Street and using carbon offsets to restore land. Can you comment on this for us, Matt?
Well, yeah, you know, I mean, when has Wall Street done anything wrong? It's the perfect solution, right? What could possibly go wrong? Look, I mean, the problem with biodiversity credits is that, you know, what is a koala worth? You know, like, and more importantly, if somebody said, you know, if you valued a koala and somebody came along and said, well, yeah, I'll pay that. Can I kill a koala? Is that okay? And you go, well, no, you know. I mean, another classic example is the Yukon Gorge, right? You know, the mining, Rio Tinto thought that, you know, ancient Aboriginal rock art was worth less than the iron ore underneath it. And so they blew it up. But, you know, the problem wasn't that the Yukon Gorge wasn't valued properly. The problem is we were trying to value it in the first place. You know, because the moment you value something, what you're saying is if I'm a crazy billionaire who, you know, spends billions of dollars on Twitter, say, and I decided I wanted to blow it up, can I come along and give you, what amount of money do I need to come along and give you so that I can blow it up? And if you valued something in dollar terms, then effectively you're saying there is an amount of money that I will accept in order for you to blow that up. And, you know, if you've got some crazy billionaire who wants to do that just for the hell of it, with you know, tens of billions of dollars to splash around, then it's entirely possible that somebody might come along and do that. And so the problem is you're trying to value something that really, when we get down to it, doesn't have a value. It's too important to value. And by kind of engaging in this kind of fake market stuff where we put dollar values on things, all we're doing is setting ourselves up to have somebody come along and say, well, yeah, I'll pay that. And I'll produce an outcome that you don't want. Whereas what we should be doing is, well, what is the problem? Well, you know, species are going extinct. Species are becoming endangered. Let's target that. Let's fix the actual problem. Let's not make a fake market to kind of solve another problem. Let's actually find out, well, how do we stop? Let's protect habitat directly, not have the private sector go, well, I'm going to tear down this really valuable habitat, but, you know, on the other side of the country somewhere, I'm going to, you know, rope off an area of land of the same size that doesn't have any of that habitat and say, well, that's an offset. It's not really an offset at all. Yeah, so yeah, these kind of fake markets are a problem, not a solution.
Do you have any thoughts, Matt, and this might be out of the parameters of your talk today, but do you have any thoughts on how those of us who are deeply concerned about the commodification of all these natural systems can have our voices heard to try to say this approach is not appropriate?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the only thing you can do is talk to politicians and talk to your family and friends and explain the problem, because I don't think that people fully understand. I mean, part of the language of, you know, well, oh, well, there's an offset. It kind of feels like, well, you know, if this development or this mine or whatever it is takes place, it doesn't have an impact on the environment because there's an offset somewhere else. And you just need to explain, well, that's not true. You know, all that's really happening is another bit of land that doesn't have, that might not be appropriate, is occurring. And also just ask the question, do we need more habitat or less habitat? Because at the moment we're reducing the amount of habitat, and so ultimately we're failing because it's being reduced all the time. And how do we increase it? Well, not cutting more of it down is the way we reduce it. And so, you know, the complicated solutions are not always the best ones. Jon Stewart, a comedian, once famously said, if you want to do something really evil, wrap it in something boring. And often that's what we do. We wrap it in a boring or complicated thing to hide the fact that we're doing evil.
I couldn't agree more. And back in the 90s, when everyone started breaking up the electricity sector and using systems that were designed by people in the stock market, I mean, we were sitting back and saying, if they're going to make it this complicated, we know that it's not going to be good for people or planet. It's only going to be good for those creating the markets in the first place. So, yes. Folks, I just want to mention that if you are interested in more information about these market-based approaches to nature, Ayla hosted a webinar yesterday, which will be up on our website next week. And the Green Institute is also hosting a webinar about these market-based approaches to our precious, beautiful, essential natural world. And we really do urge all of you to get engaged with these issues because these systems are not going to work. They are not going to help the living world. And exactly as Matt said, fake markets, but they have been designed with a particular purpose, smoke and mirrors, to delay taking real action. Matt, that has actually brought us to 1:30. We have thoroughly used up your brain for 90 minutes, and we're so grateful for you, number one, for being with us today and sharing your incredible wisdom and insights, but also too for stepping in for poor Richard Dennis, who, for those who missed the announcement, he does have pneumonia. So we're very pleased that you could join us, Matt, and we hope to invite you back into NENA conversations into the future. But for now, could everybody do some kind of Zoom thank you, whether that's I often do the Daggy air clap. I think it's very stylish, yes, or press the little button.
Thank you.
And I will give a plug for the Australia Institute, an incredible, wonderful institute full of people giving us seriously objective information about the stuff that's going on in our world. So do check out the Australia Institute and be a supporter or subscribe. And of course, get connected to NENA if you're new to the New Economy Network Australia, or if you've come through here from the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. Thanks so much, everyone. Love having you with us on these very important issues, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you. See ya.